Thank you, Marie, for the introduction. Marie's actually been trying to get hold of me to do this talk for some time, and I've been putting it off for quite a while. So what are we getting into today? We're going to be speaking about component-based UI testing with Cypress and Storybook, and this is our agenda. So first of all, we're going to kick off with the end result, look at actually what we're trying to achieve, followed by the application architecture. We're going to have a look at some of the tooling that I've used. We're then going to get hands-on into the code and understand what I've done there. After that, we're going to have a think about what we're actually testing with this approach. And then finally, some lessons learned, followed by some questions. So I wanted to start off, first of all, with a video. I'm just going to play this now. And hopefully you can kind of see the speed of which these tests are running at. Now, back in the day when I was doing end-to-end automation, I'd be really happy if I had a test running on the UI in about 20 seconds. That was a good test for me. However, it wasn't uncommon for me to see tests that would take a minute, 2 minutes, sometimes even 5 minutes. So just let these tests run through now. And we can see we've executed about 13 tests in 35 seconds, which I think for me is pretty good going. So now that I've caught your attention, that is a bit about me. Marie's already done a great introduction. But yeah, as she said, I'm a test architect at ECS Digital. I'm currently working at an enterprise energy firm and defining the test strategy for multiple global teams there. And as Marie mentioned, we used to work together, and she can vouch for me when I say I regularly get told off for dismantling things, which is great for me being a tester. I like taking things apart and figuring out how these things work. So before we can devise a test strategy, I think it's always very important that we understand the underlying architecture of the application. The particular application architecture we had for this framework that I built was mostly a microservice approach. So we had about 5 or 6 microservices. They were written in Node, then containerized and deployed to AKS. AKS being Azure's container service. And then these services were exposed via an API gateway. And then finally, we had a client-side React framework being statically served from blob storage. And we had Redux and Redux Saga for our state management. So what was the problem that I was trying to solve with this framework? And the answer that I was trying to answer, or the question that I was trying to answer was to how can I provide fast deterministic feedback when working with third parties? So in this particular instance, we had a third party that was providing us our identity. And unfortunately for our team, this third party enforced MFA. Now you could do something around MFA with automation. We could go and get the code from an email or send the code to a phone. But all of this adds new sort of points of failure, which I wasn't really keen on doing, as well as they massively slow down the tests running. In addition to that, logging into a different domain isn't really supported by Cypress currently. It would have been a blocker for us using Cypress. And to make matters worse, we couldn't authenticate through an API. So not ideal. And then 2 more points I wanted to talk about as well, which was if you're familiar with end-to-end testing with microservices, it can be very hard to understand when something goes wrong in the UI where these problems are lying. Is it the front end? Is it this service? All these things take time and effort, which I wanted to try and avoid. And then finally, some of you might be familiar with some of the testing libraries that React provide. Not React provide, but some of the testing libraries available to us. So things like Enzyme or React testing libraries. Now, although I do rate these testing libraries from the point of that it's encouraging developers to write more tests, I have a few issues with these libraries. One of which is it's a very black boxy sort of thing. We're not really sure what's happening under the hood. The idea is that you kind of give this function a component to deep or shallow render. There's some complexity around that. The tests tend to very much focus on the implementation. So I'll regularly see a test written like, render this component with some items in a list, and then assert that this component has 3 items in a list. I don't really see much value on this sort of testing approach. It's very much focused on the implementation, not the behavior of the components. So I spent quite a long time pondering this over and trying a few approaches, trying to do better UI testing. And we were already using a tool called Storybook. Now, for those of you that are familiar with Storybook, it's very much not a testing tool. It's mostly used for UI developers to build simple components or component-based UIs. And the idea is you have this component, it's a bit dumb, you give it some properties to render the component in different states, and then you can see it inside the Storybook UI. And I'll show you Storybook in a little bit. So I started to think about how we could maybe repurpose Storybook and use it from more like a testing perspective. I thought about if you know React, you'll know that. So I thought about maybe we could start to mount the store from Redux and see how that would look, if it would work at all. There wasn't really much documentation online about how you would get this working, but I just tried it out. And lo and behold, it started to work. We started to have the component mount. We started to have the sagas execute and starting to try and get data from somewhere. And this then allowed a very interesting opportunity to fulfill that data promise from something. Now, in the early days, I actually had the full backend running locally on my machine, all these microservices, providing this data to Storybook, and it started to look like it could work. And we had the Storybook loading, we had data in there, but it was very intense on my machine, having all these microservices running. And then having this running in CI would be even more difficult. How are we going to pull in the different versions of the backend, the different containers? This would all take time. And that's kind of when I started to think about, well, what if we started to stub out the backend instead? Maybe this would be a better way of giving data to the front end inside Storybook. So I went around doing this. I used a library called Synon.js to mutate the client-side code and basically start providing us stub data. Worked pretty well. I would say a year later, in retrospect, I would do it a bit differently. I would go for a tool called Stubbing.js, which actually, instead of mutating your client-side code, you'd have a separate server that would spin up and provide that data to you. What was quite nice with this is that it makes our testing more deterministic. So instead of having several microservices running in the back end, we can start to think about if a test fails, then it's most likely related to either our mocks or it's going to be related to the client side not working anymore. Cool. So that's pretty much it for the talking part for now. We're now going to go hands-on. I can sort of show you through Storybook and some of our tests that we have and the approach that we took. So here we've got Storybook. And you can see here some of our low-level components. We've got a header here. We've got a carousel. And all of these low-level components start to build up and make a bigger page component. Again, Storybook is mostly used for components, but we've kind of repurposed it and started to have our pages in here. So down here, for example, we've got the profile page. What's quite nice is we can pop this out of Storybook and we can just load the component page in isolation. All of the data you're seeing here from like the initial or the opening hours or specialisms, they're all coming from the stub backend. And we can start to click on things. We can start to test or exercise some of the business logic. So maybe I'm going to make a change here and I'll click off and we can start to see some of the business logic being executed. This also opens up a really interesting opportunity, which it means you can test at various different levels and testing at the right level. So for example, we have opening hours here. I can maybe trigger this error message. Maybe I've got an opening hour after my closing hour. I'd expect that to trigger some sort of error message. But is this the right place to actually test this logic? Maybe I should look just going down to the opening hours component, render it in isolation by itself, and test the logic here. We're making our test much more deterministic. If this was to fail, I know it's just to do with this component here and not the page that wraps around it, if that makes sense. Okay, so now we've kind of seen what Storybook looks like. We're going to go into the code. Just going to grab some more water. Can everyone see the code before? Should I zoom in? Someone give me a sign. I'm going to zoom in. Okay, so this is an example of Storybook and how our Storybook looks. We've got this function called stories of. And actually, I think Storybook has changed recently. I think this is the older way of writing stories. If we look at Storybook, we can see Storybook 6.0 is available. I haven't gone to that version just yet. But we've got this function, we're declaring how our story should look. We've got this decorator, which we'll come back to in a little second. And then we've got our story here. So don't see schedule, we're basically providing us our component that we want to render. Now notice that we're just providing the component. There's no properties being passed, no props being passed into this component in this instance. I know some have got props being passed in, but generally speaking, not passing any data into the component. The component is very much making the asynchronous calls out to the backend or a backend and having data being pulled in that way. We can ignore this eyes configuration object. That's all around apptools. So if you're familiar with apptools, this works very well with Storybook, but that is for a different time, not today. And then coming back to this add decorator function, what this allows us to do is it provides us the story to render here, and we're calling this function called setup story. Now this is a high order component, and what it's doing is we provide the story to render, some locale information, and then some information around how we're going to configure our stubs to be returned. So we'll hop into that. So this is setup story. And what we want to do here is basically clean all of our state out before we load the component. Each test wants to be isolated and repeatable. So we're going to go ahead and clear out our store. We're going to clear out our local storage. We might want to run a setup function beforehand. If we're going to load stubs, we'll go and get those stubs. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then down here, what we have is the React component structure. So all of this needs to wrap around our component before it renders. And what we're trying to do here is represent the application under test. So if I was to pull up the root of our web app, which is just here, you will notice that these are very, very similar. So we've got our theme provider, we've got our styles, we've got our connected router, that loads to some auth stuff. We come up here, we've got our initialize. And what we're trying to do here is make Storybook be very representative of our application. You'll notice over time, or at least I noticed over time, sometimes the developers would update the root and not update the setup story function. And that kind of creates this drift in the application and Storybook. And when that drift occurs, it's making our tests less representative and less valuable. So that's definitely something we can talk to the team about and make sure they're aware of it. There's a few times over the last year that I was working on this where I had to come in and set up story. So that's something to be aware of. And then for our stubs, what we have here is a component called stub data, and that's pretty much, once again, just a React component. And we're saying here, render our children, and then override this function. So any calls to this function with the arguments, we want to resolve some repair types, or we want to resolve some sort of data, right? And these are just static JSON, nothing impressive. We tried really hard to keep the stubs fairly trivial, not getting too complicated. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But that is pretty much the approach we've taken. I can try and show you one of these tests running now. So let's just trigger Cypress. Cool. So what this test is doing is it's going to load the component up in isolation, and there's no need to go to logging in. There's no need to set the page up in a particular state. It just loads it up, it's there, it's good to go. We fill out this form, we click on save. That's going to submit a request to, to the backend, which doesn't exist. But what's quite nice is that if I look at this test in Cypress, in the code, which is just here, so this is our code here. We've got task creation, we've got all of our page objects inside the file, so all of our CSS selectors inside the file, and we've got some expected input values, so some of the things we're going to fill the form out with. And in our test, what we're doing is we're starting up the Cypress server, and we want to catch any requests that are going to be on tasks. So when we click on submit, we want Cypress to catch that request. And then here's our test. Let's look at this one. So load the page up, click on create new task. We want to fill out all the information in that form. We want to click on submit, and that's going to send off the request to our backend, which Cypress can then catch. And then we're expecting that the body in that request has got the expected results. So that's pretty much the test. We're going to speak about how deep this test actually is in a little second. That's pretty much it for the hands-on bits. Something else worth speaking about as well, which has been really cool with this project, is quite regularly when I'm doing exploratory testing, or when I was doing exploratory testing on this project, I would use Storybook to do my automation, do some exploratory testing, and then when I was finding bugs or defects I couldn't fix myself, I'd quite often write the test to replicate the bug. And what that allowed me to do was send the branch over to a developer, or speak to the developer and say, and this thing isn't working, here's the automated test to replicate the bug. And he can come over and run the tests locally. They're very easy to run, they're fast to run, and then they were able to write the code to actually resolve the bug, and then use the tests to validate the bug had been fixed. So it almost enabled UI-based TDD, which I thought was really cool, and really benefited the team in that respect. Cool. So what's Storybook testing? So I wanted to speak a bit about the depth of this test. So even though we're opening the component up in isolation, and it's not opening it in the real application, we're still making sure that the component can render inside Storybook. We can make sure that the sagas are being triggered correctly, that we're going to go and exercise the API calls, that we're going to go and grab the data and must return correctly. We're going to make sure that Redux then takes that data and propagates it down through into the application component correctly. And then finally, that the component renders the data. So that's what Storybook does. And then when you combine that with Cypress, We're then able to also test the business logic of that component in isolation. We're able to focus on the behavior, so making sure things are appearing, disappearing, and finally, when we submit requests to our front end, so from the front end to the back end, we can catch those requests and assert on the body and on the headers. And I feel like these sort of tests are much more comprehensive and much more representative compared to an enzyme unit test. They're not as fast, they're a bit slower, but they're still much faster than your typical traditional end-to-end testing. So with that in mind, are page objects valuable? And to answer that question, we really have to think about what the purpose of page objects actually is. Now, for me, page objects are a model of the application to encapsulate and abstract user journeys. But given that we only have one page and we open the test on the one page, do we really need to have the page objects? And personally, I don't think we do. Although there have been people in the team who have thought that it's still useful. It's also worth mentioning as well that these are functional UI tests, and since this approach, we've started to build out our end-to-end test capability, where we have started to see some duplication for having the selectors inside these integration tests, but then also inside the end-to-end tests. So going forward, I think it would actually make sense to have some sort of object to help the selectors, which both the end-to-end tests and then these Cypress storybook tests can use. But yeah, something to think about. So I guess some tips and tricks around stubs. Maintaining stubs can be very difficult. I personally found that you can be much more defensive against stub pitfalls by focusing your tests very much on the behavior and less so on the data that the stubs are providing. So for example, it's quite often that I'll see a UI test validating that they do something on the page, and then they're going to assert that do something on the page, maybe an error message shows on the page, and they're then going to assert on that error message. So they'll say, this error component contains the text. And by doing that, we're very much coupling ourselves to this data that's being returned to that error message. And what I much rather prefer is seeing, you load the page up, we validate that the error message is not shown on the page currently, so making sure it couldn't give us a false positive. Then we perform the action that will cause the error message, followed by asserting that that element's visible and not on the data. It's also worth mentioning as well that as stubs get more complicated, we start to test more of the stub and less of the application. So something that I've seen was that with this approach was that developers are very keen to start making the stubs more clever. So maybe after we submit a request, we'll start responding with that new thing that we've added. And I personally found that wasn't very valuable for that reason. The more complicated our stubs are getting, the less we're testing our application. Cool. So some final thoughts here then. We have to bear in mind that this is not true end-to-end testing. What it does mean is we can push a lot of our, the bulk of our business logic testing down to a lower level, but we're still going to have to do some level of end-to-end testing. I always feel that the end-to-end tests should very much be user journeys throughout the application, and that we shouldn't be doing things like testing boundaries or testing business logic or error messages, very much focusing on that light touch. We also need to think about as well that Storybook doesn't really represent the whole app, and that can cause issues, especially if things like CDNs or firewalls or API gateways sit in front of the actual application. These are all points of failure and all need to be tested individually and then together. Yeah, it's also fair to mention as well that to implement something like this can be fairly complicated, And you're going to need to have some understanding of how React applications are built and be comfortable contributing to the application itself as well. And that's it. I feel like I've raced through this much faster than I was supposed to. So I'm sure there's plenty of questions and plenty of time for questions. So to recap, the problem was how can we provide fast and reliable feedback to the team? We had a look at some of the tooling, Storybook and Cypress. We also had a look at how we can use decorators to abstract complexity when setting up the component stories, making it very easy for developers just to copy the component in and the data would go and find itself. We also spoke about how to test at the right level and very much testing at the lower level components in the correct place. We also spoke briefly about page objects and their value to the project in this case. And then finally, we had a talk about working with stubs over time.